On a sugar island in the Caribbean in 1730, a barrel of a harsh, clear liquor was loaded onto a ship bound for the coast of West Africa, where it would be traded, quite literally, for human beings. The liquor was rum, and by that point it had become one of the main currencies of the transatlantic slave trade. Ships carried it across the ocean specifically to buy enslaved people. A drink you can now pour into a fruity cocktail on a beach vacation was, for well over a century, exchanged for men, women, and children in chains. And its story is soaked in more blood, war, and rebellion than almost anything else behind a bar. That sounds obscene, because it was. But the fact that this one spirit sat at the dark heart of slavery, fueled pirates and navies, helped spark the American Revolution, and was quite literally called Kill Devil tells you something. Rum was never just a drink. It never was. So how did the waste product of the sugar industry, a sticky black sludge that planters used to throw away, become a spirit that financed empires, powered the world's most brutal trade in human lives, and armed the greatest navy on earth? To understand that, you have to go back to a single small island in the 1600s, where sugar, slavery, and alcohol collided to create something entirely new. That island was Barbados. In the 1640s, English planters there, using knowledge and equipment brought from Brazil, had turned the island into a sugar machine, worked by thousands of enslaved Africans, and making sugar produced an enormous amount of waste, a thick dark syrup called molasses, left over after the sugar crystals were extracted. Planters had little use for it, and much of it was simply dumped. Then someone, and it was almost certainly enslaved workers experimenting on the plantations, discovered that if you fermented that molasses and then distilled it, you got a powerful, clear, blazing alcohol. This was one of the first great acts of recycling in the modern economy, taking a worthless, sticky waste product and, through fermentation and the heat of a still, transforming it into something that could be sold, shipped, and traded around the world. The people who made this discovery got no credit and no freedom for it. They were property themselves. But their ingenuity created an entirely new global commodity. Rum was born, not as a luxury, but out of garbage. It was the alchemy of turning the sugar industry's trash into something valuable, and it happened cruelly in one of the most brutal places on Earth. The oldest rum distillery still operating today, Mount Gay in Barbados, traces its roots back to a deed from 1703, making rum older as a continuous industry than almost any spirit you can name. And it was rough. The earliest rum was so harsh and fiery that the people who drank it gave it brutal nicknames. A document from Barbados around 1651 describes the island's favourite drink as rum bullion, alias Kill Devil, and calls it a hot, hellish, and terrible liquor. Nobody is entirely sure where the word rum comes from, but the best guess is that it descends from rum bullion or rumbustion, Old English slang for an uproar or a brawl, which tells you exactly what happened when people drank enough of it. This was not a sipping spirit. It was cheap, strong, and violent, the drink of sailors, labourers, and the enslaved. And it was about to conquer the Atlantic world. Because rum had a property that made it far more than a drink. It could be stored, shipped, and traded, and unlike wine or beer, it did not spoil. In a world without stable money in the colonies, rum became something close to liquid currency, and that turned it into one of the engines of the most horrific commercial system in human history, the transatlantic slave trade. Here is how it worked, in a brutal loop historians call the triangular trade. Molasses, the sugar waste from Caribbean plantations, was shipped north to New England, where a booming distilling industry turned it into rum. In fact, rum became the great industry of colonial New England. The small city of Newport, Rhode Island, alone had more than 20 rum distilleries lining its harbour, and rum made up a huge share of the region's entire economy. New England distillers grew so skilled and so cheap that their rum undercut competitors across the Atlantic world. That New England rum was then loaded onto ships and carried across the Atlantic to the west coast of Africa. There it was traded to slave dealers in exchange for captured human beings. Those enslaved people were then packed into ships and carried through the horror of the Middle Passage to the Caribbean and the Americas, where they were forced to labour on the very sugar plantations that produced the molasses. And then the loop began again. If you are finding this video interesting, hit subscribe. We dig into the hidden histories behind drinks every week, and you will not want to miss what is coming next. Sit with that for a moment. Rum was not just a product that happened to exist alongside slavery. Rum was a currency of slavery. Traders on the African coast who had once been paid in French brandy were now paid in rum, and some New England distillers made special high-strength batches specifically for buying human beings. The comfortable drink at the centre of so many holidays was, for generations, the literal medium of exchange for the buying and selling of people. That is the original sin baked into every bottle, and it is the part of rum's history that its cheerful, tropical, modern image works very hard to help us forget. The wealth of entire cities, elegant townhouses, churches, universities and banks in both the Caribbean and New England was built on this loop, on sugar, rum, and the enslaved people who produced them both. The profits were staggering, and so was the human cost. On the sugar plantations that fed the whole system, enslaved workers were routinely worked to death, and the rum they distilled was sometimes handed back to them as a small ration, a cruel comfort inside their own bondage. While rum was funding the slave trade, it was also becoming the defining drink of the sea, and this is where the pirates come in. During the golden age of piracy, in the late 1600s and early 1700s, the Caribbean was swarming with buccaneers, and the ships they raided were often loaded with rum. Pirate havens like Port Royal in Jamaica were packed with taverns serving the stuff. Rum and the outlaw life of the sea became permanently linked in the popular imagination. There is even a theory that pirate crews, made up of escaped slaves, deserters and outcasts, drank and shared rum partly as a levelling ritual, a small taste of freedom and equality on ships that often ran more democratically than the brutal merchant and navy vessels they preyed upon. But here is a fun piece of fact-checking. That classic pirate chant, yo-ho-ho and a bottle of rum, was not a real sea shanty bellowed by actual pirates. It was invented by the author Robert Louis Stevenson for his novel Treasure Island in 1883, more than a century after the great pirates were gone. Much of what we picture when we think of rum-swilling pirates, the peg legs, the parrots, the R, comes from fiction, not history. The real pirates drank rum, yes, but they mostly drank whatever they could steal. The romantic pirate image was largely written into being by novelists and much later by Hollywood. The far deeper connection between rum and the sea was not piracy. It was the most powerful navy on earth, the British Royal Navy. In 1655, England seized Jamaica from Spain, and suddenly the Navy had access to a vast, cheap supply of Caribbean rum. Sailors had long been given a daily alcohol ration to keep morale up, originally beer, but beer spoiled and took up precious space. Rum did not, so the Navy switched, and the legendary daily rum ration was born. At first, sailors were handed their rum more or less neat, and predictably, this produced a fleet full of drunk, brawling men. So in 1740, an admiral named Edward Vernon ordered that the sailors' rum be watered down before it was issued. Vernon was nicknamed Old Grog after the coarse grogram cloak he liked to wear, and so his diluted rum picked up a nickname too, grog. That word is still with us. When you wake up feeling groggy, you are etymologically hungover on Admiral Vernon's watered-down Navy rum. Over time, sailors also got sugar and lime added to their ration, which had the enormous side benefit of helping fight scurvy, the vitamin deficiency that killed more sailors than any battle. In fact, the British habit of dosing sailors with lime juice is exactly where the old nickname for a British person, limey, comes from. It is worth being precise here, because the story often gets garbled. Admiral Vernon's original order was really about watering down the rum to curb drunkenness, and the life-saving link between citrus and scurvy was only fully understood and enforced later. But once it was, cheap rum, sugar and lime together helped make the Royal Navy the healthiest, and therefore the most powerful, fighting force on the seas. The daily rum ration became one of the most sacred traditions in the Royal Navy, and it lasted an astonishingly long time, all the way to the 20th century. It was only ended on the 31st of July, 1970, a day sailors mournfully called Black Tot Day. On that final day, crews across the Navy wore black armbands, held mock funerals, and even tossed tots of rum into the sea, grieving the end of a ritual more than 300 years old, killed off because modern warships were too full of delicate machinery to be run by men who had been drinking since breakfast. For 3 centuries, an empire had literally floated on rum. On Black Tot Day, that tide finally went out. Now, while rum was arming the British Navy, it was also quietly helping to tear the British Empire apart, on the other side of the Atlantic, because in the American colonies rum was not a treat, it was a way of life. Colonial Americans drank staggering amounts of it, more per person than we can easily imagine today. By some estimates, the average colonist drank several gallons of rum a year. It warmed them through winters, it was served at elections, funerals and barn raisins, and it was even used as a medicine and a painkiller. Candidates for office would hand out free rum to win votes, a young George Washington among them. The rum industry was central to the New England economy, and rum was so woven into daily life that it was practically a food group, and that is exactly why the British government made a fateful mistake. To protect its own sugar islands, Britain passed the Molasses Act of 1733, and later the Sugar Act of 1764, taxing the cheap French molasses that New England distillers depended on to make their rum. To the colonists, this was an intolerable attack on their livelihood and a tax imposed without their consent. It fueled massive smuggling, deep resentment, and a growing sense that Britain was strangling the colonies for profit. Years later, the founding father John Adams himself remarked that he saw no reason to be ashamed to admit that molasses had been an essential ingredient in American independence. The taxes on the raw material of rum were among the very first sparks of the American Revolution. There is even a legend that on the night of his famous midnight ride, Paul Revere stopped at a distillery for a fortifying drink of rum before setting off to warn that the British were coming. Whether or not that particular story is true, rum was undeniably woven into the birth of the United States. But the revolution also began rum's long decline in America. The war disrupted the molasses trade, and afterward, waves of Scottish and Irish immigrants moved inland, where they grew grain and distilled what they knew: whiskey. Rum, the spirit of the colonial era, slowly gave way to whiskey, the spirit of the new American nation. Rum's role as hard currency did not stop at the edges of the Atlantic, though. On the other side of the world, in the brand new British penal colony of Australia, coins were so scarce that rum, and spirits in general, became the de facto money of the whole settlement. People were literally paid in alcohol, and a corrupt clique of army officers, nicknamed the Rum Corps, seized control of the liquor trade and grew rich and powerful on it. When a new governor arrived to break their monopoly, a man you may know as the same Captain Bligh from the famous mutiny on the Bounty, the officers marched on Government House and overthrew him in 1808. It is the only military coup in Australian history, and it went down in legend as the Rum Rebellion. Now, to be fair, historians point out the coup was really a broader power struggle, and the catchy name was slapped on decades later. But the underlying fact is astonishing enough. On the far side of the planet, rum had become so much like money that people staged a coup, in part over control of it. Rum might have faded into a rough, unfashionable relic, if not for a revolution in the drink itself, and it happened in Cuba. For most of its history, rum had been that harsh, dark, kill devil liquor. Then in 1862, a Spanish-born wine merchant in Santiago de Cuba, named Don Facundo Bacardi, set out to tame it. He experimented for years and pioneered a new process. He isolated a special strain of yeast, filtered his rum through charcoal to strip out the harsh impurities, and aged it in white oak barrels. The result was something the world had never seen. A smooth, clean, light-bodied rum you could actually sip and mix with pleasure. He had invented white rum, and he founded a company under the symbol of a bat, Bacardi. There is a lovely detail here. The bat logo came from the fruit bats that roosted in the rafters of that first little distillery. And because so many customers could not read, they would simply ask for the rum with the bat. That symbol would go on to become one of the most recognized spirit brands on the planet. Bacardi grew from a tiny Cuban distillery into the largest privately held spirits company in the world. This changed everything. Suddenly, rum was not just sailors' grog or plantation moonshine. It could be elegant. It could be the base of sophisticated cocktails. In Cuba, that lighter rum gave birth to drinks that conquered the world, the daiquiri, the mojito, and when mixed with a brand new American soft drink, the Cuba Libre, rum and Coca-Cola. Rum was becoming glamorous. And then came an unexpected gift to the rum industry, American Prohibition. When the United States banned alcohol in 1920, thirsty Americans looked south, and the Caribbean, especially Cuba, became a booze-soaked playground just a short boat ride from the dry American coast. Rum came flooding illegally into the country, carried by smugglers known as rum-runners. Ships would anchor in a line just outside American waters, a floating black market nicknamed Rum Row, and small fast boats would dart out to buy their cargo. One famous rum runner, a man named Bill McCoy, was known for selling genuine, unwatered down, high-quality liquor, and many believe that is where we get the phrase "the real McCoy." Prohibition, meant to end drinking, instead turned rum smuggling into a booming, romantic criminal enterprise. It also handed the Caribbean rum industry a golden age. With American whiskey distilleries shut down and gathering dust, thirsty Americans developed a taste for Cuban rum and Cuban cocktails, and the islands boomed as glamorous wet escapes from a dry and hypocritical mainland. When Prohibition was finally repealed, American distilleries were years behind, and rum had cemented its place as the spirit of sun, sea, and forbidden fun. After Prohibition ended, rum kept its exotic, escapist glamour. In the 1930s and 40s, a craze called tiki culture swept America, with themed bars decked out like Polynesian islands, serving elaborate rum-soaked cocktails like the Mai Tai and the Zombie in tiki mugs. Bartenders like Don the Beachcomber guarded their secret rum recipes as fiercely as any distiller, blending different rums into potent tropical concoctions so strong that some bars limited how many a customer could order. Rum had completed a remarkable image makeover. From the hellish liquor of slave ships and grimy taverns, it had become the taste of the tropical getaway, of sunshine, beaches, and escape. But the 20th century had one more twist for rum. In 1959, the Cuban Revolution brought Fidel Castro to power, and his government seized and nationalized the island's private businesses, including its famous rum distilleries. The Bacardi family, seeing what was coming, fled into exile, but they had cleverly protected their trademarks and yeast strains abroad, and they rebuilt their empire outside Cuba, in Puerto Rico and beyond. When the United States then imposed its embargo on Cuba, authentic Cuban rum vanished from American shelves, where it remains largely banned to this day, a strange Cold War hangover in a glass. It set off a decades-long trademark war, still being fought, over who has the right to sell Havana Club rum to the world. A spirit born from the waste of Spanish and British sugar colonies had become a pawn in a superpower standoff. Today, rum is a global spirit worth billions, produced across the Caribbean and far beyond in dozens of styles. Crisp white rums for cocktails, rich dark rums, aged sipping rums that rival fine cognac, and spiced rums flavoured with the very spices of the old colonial trade. Rum is the taste of the Caribbean, a genuine source of pride and identity and income for the islands that make it. In recent years, a serious premium rum movement has emerged, with connoisseurs paying hundreds of dollars for aged bottles and treating rum with the same reverence long reserved for whiskey and cognac. a striking rise for a spirit once dismissed as cheap sailor's swill. And yet the shadow never fully lifts. Nearly every one of those islands carries rum's double inheritance. It is at once a beloved cultural treasure, and a permanent reminder of the sugar and slavery that gave birth to it. Some Caribbean distilleries today are consciously reckoning with that history, telling the full story of the enslaved people who created the drink, rather than hiding it behind palm trees and beach umbrellas. So the next time you sip a rum cocktail on a warm evening, that sweet, easy, tropical drink, remember what it actually carries. It carries a syrup that planters once threw away, and enslaved people who first turned that waste into fire. It carries the triangular trade in which this very liquid was exchanged for human beings, and the ships that ran that loop for over a century. It carries pirates both real and invented, a navy that ran on a daily tot until 1970, and the molasses taxes that helped ignite a revolution. It carries a coup on the far side of the world staged over control of it, a Cuban merchant's charcoal filter, the smugglers of Prohibition, and a whole culture of tiki escapism built to help everyone forget where it came from. The kill devil liquor born from garbage and bondage that financed empires and armed navies and helped found a nation is sitting in your glass right now, sweet and golden and utterly ordinary, waiting to be noticed. Rum was never just a drink. It never was, and it never will be. If this story surprised you, subscribe for more deep dives into the hidden histories behind drinks. We have got a lot more coming.